Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back at the Science Institute, at least virtually, and to be at the great American University. And thanks to all of you who are attending. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this session with my friend and former colleague, Lisa Curtis. You're going to see it soon as she makes her short presentation before the question and answer session, that she's brilliant and she has made just tremendous contributions to our security as a public servant for many years, 20 years at the CIA and the National Security Council staff, where I got to work with her when she was the senior director for South Asia. Now she is the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She served at the State Department. She served on Capitol Hill. She's a great example as well of the tremendous rewards associated with public service and the wide range of opportunities that are out there, if that is your interest. And so today the topic is strategic narcissism and how we have tried to turn conflicts, diplomacy, but especially the wars that we've been fighting since September 11th, 2001, into conflict, something alien to their nature, which is what Karl von Clausewitz warned against. And so what I'd like to talk with you about is why this is the case. Why have we had such difficulty in the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq? And in particular, why were we surprised by the difficulties and length and costs of those wars? And so in the next just 10 minutes or so, I want to take you back to the end of the Cold War in 1989. And it was in November of 1989 that the cavalry regiment to which I was assigned was patrolling the East-West German border and the West German Czechoslovak border. We were centered on Coburg, Germany, which is a great town with actually some great beer, but it's also where Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. It's the birthplace of Hans Morgenthau, who is thought to be sort of the father of the discipline of international relations. And it was on this day in November 1989 where we went from one moment staring down East German border guards to the next moment seeing the barriers thrown open, and then tens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans flooding across that barrier with bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine. I mean, there were hugs and tears of joy, and it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The East German government melted away. The Soviet Union collapsed. Hey, we had won. And soon after that, actually, exactly 30 years ago today, I was commanding those same troopers who had witnessed this tremendous geostrategic shift in Saudi Arabia as we attacked into Iraq as part of Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait, to go back to the status quo, and to turn Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis and defeat Saddam Hussein's army. And it was those two successes, the lopsided victory in Desert Storm and winning the Cold War without firing a shot, that gave impetus to a high degree of confidence about this post-Cold War era. But sadly, that confidence turned into overconfidence. And that overconfidence bred complacency and led to, I think, a widespread acceptance of three fundamentally flawed assumptions about that post-Cold War period. First of all, that ideological competition was over, right? An arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. A corollary to that is that a great power competition was a relic of the past. And what I'd like to talk about today is the third of these assumptions, which was that military prowess, that technological military prowess that was demonstrated in the Gulf War, 30 years ago today, while I'm getting old, would guarantee the security of our country. If any foe even had the temerity to challenge the United States and other advanced Western nations, mainly NATO members, that war would be fast, cheap, efficient, and waged mainly from standoff range with these new precision strike-related technologies. Well, that was all a setup. That was a setup. That over-optimism was and a touch of hubris was a setup for the difficulties encountered in wars like Afghanistan, Iraq. And we'll talk about Afghanistan in this session because we'll talk more about Iraq in the next lecture. But what many people neglected as they made this argument that, hey, the next war is going to be really, really fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it because we have these new technological capabilities, what people called the revolution in military affairs, is that we neglected continuities in the nature of war, and we're overly enamored with these technological shifts in the character of warfare. And what I'd like to do is highlight 4 continuities in the nature of war and how the neglect of those continuities complicated and made what was already going to be a tough endeavor, a tough mission in Afghanistan, even more difficult. And the first of these continuities is that war is an extension of politics. Okay, well, it might sound like the Geico commercial to you, as I mentioned before, but everybody knows that, right? Because Karl von Clausewitz said that war is an extension of politics. But what that means is that the consolidation of military gains to get to sustainable political outcomes, that's not like an optional phase of conflict. It's central to war planning and the implementation of those plans. And whereas the initial campaign in Afghanistan was tremendously successful as our courageous intelligence officers and special operations forces operated with militias opposed to the Taliban and employed our tremendous air power capability, that had the effect of collapsing the Taliban regime, but it didn't have the effect of being able to bridge into that sustainable political outcome. Because what happened? Those militias that we relied on, they essentially affected state capture of nascent state institutions and functions, Afghan state institutions and functions, which have been destroyed, for decades of conflict, right? The Soviet occupation from 80 to 88, the devastating civil war from 92 to 96, and then the horrible Taliban regime, right? Who turned institutions really almost against their very purpose. But by relying so heavily on the militias and not committing really the forces and especially maybe the diplomatic effort to help develop these institutions had to be built from the ground up. These militias were motivated instead by consolidating their own power to be in a position of relative advantage in relation to other groups. And what they had in mind is hey, if things go bad here, the U.S. just leaves, like they did after their support for the Mujahideen resistance to the Soviet occupation from 1980 to 1988. We want to be in a position of relative advantage. And so these groups over time morphed into criminalized patronage networks that were motivated really by capturing these institutions, gaining power, and they were actually also stakeholders in state weakness because it was the weakness of their own institutions that gave them impunity and allowed them to pursue the consolidation of power as well as ill-gotten gains associated with illicit networks. So, hey, war is an extension of politics. And in every conflict, in every use of military force, except for just maybe a raid, the political dimension of the conflict has to be foundational to what you're trying to achieve and the strategy that you employ. The second continuity in the nature of war that we neglected was that war is human. War is human because people fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. And if you don't take into consideration what is driving the violence, then you're condemned to only really treating the symptoms, which some people refer to as, oh, just a CT, a counterterrorism pure approach, which mainly would consist of raids or drone strikes. Well, how does that relate to what is actually driving the conflict in Afghanistan? Of course, it doesn't. What's necessary is some form of a political accommodation based on communities within Afghanistan, their confidence that they can best advance and protect their interests through a political process rather than through violence. So it is that intra-Afghan agreement that a lot of our diplomatic efforts, multinational diplomatic efforts, should be focused on. But we didn't really focus adequately on it, and we're certainly not focusing on that today. The third continuity that we neglected is that war is uncertain. War is uncertain mainly because of its interactive nature. It's uncertain because it's complicated based on the political and human dimensions of war. But of course, we are not the only ones, or one side is not the only side to determine the future course of events. The enemies have a say in the future course of events. And if you consider the way that we conducted the war in Afghanistan, we got into the habit, really, which is, I think, unprecedented, of announcing years in advance, exactly the number of troops we would have, what those troops would do and would not do. And of course, this was a tremendous boon to the Taliban and terrorist organizations, who could just wait us out and could adapt their strategies to the strategy that we announced and gave them. Essentially gave them our plans years in advance. And they would found it easy to retain a degree of the initiative as a result. And then finally, war is a contest of wills, right? And this philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, said, really, winning in war means convincing your enemy that your enemy has been defeated. And what we did in Afghanistan and in Iraq was kind of the opposite. By saying, hey, we're leaving. We kept saying we're leaving. And what that did is that had a psychological effect on the enemy, who said, okay, yeah, we can wait for that. But also it had an effect on our friends who looked behind their backs and said, hey, who's got my back? Well, I guess nobody. So we better cut some deals internally. And this empowered these criminalized patronage networks and so-called warlords and their networks. And those who are neutral, what do? They start hedging. Well, if the Taliban comes back in, I might want to be seen as one who was maybe adamantly opposed to them. So it really had a terrible effect on the will of our friends in Afghanistan. And I would say that the incoherence, the inconsistency, the flawed assumptions that underpin our strategy based on what Lisa Curtis is going to talk about, which is strategic narcissism, the tendency to define these problems in this competition only in relation to us, and to assume that what we do or decide not to do will be decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome, and not considering the agency and the authorship over the future that the other has, right? This is a problem because it sets us up. It sets us up for what was already going to be a difficult war, to make it more difficult, more lengthy, and more costly. And of course, if the American people don't understand, hey, what is at stake in Afghanistan, and what is a strategy that will get us to a favorable outcome at an acceptable cost, then the American people lose their will and confidence as well. And you hear today the mantra of ending the endless war in Afghanistan, but that might be the most dramatic example of strategic narcissism. The assumption that underpins the endless war is that wars end when one side just decides to disengage. And of course, that's not the case. And I think we're set up for a potential humanitarian catastrophe and a strengthening of jihadist terrorists who already want to commit another terrorist attack, a mass murder attack on the scale of September 11th, 2001. And so, hey, the Q&A function is there for you. So as you're listening to Lisa, think about what questions you have. I will monitor that. Lisa will make her remarks, and then we'll go into a question and answer session. But you're in for a real treat here. Lisa, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, General McMaster, for inviting me to speak today. And thank you all for being here. Um, so I'm going to speak today about the strategic narcissism that has developed in our policy and United States policy toward Afghanistan. But first, let me just say a few remarks about General McMaster. Working for General McMaster when he was National Security Advisor was by far the highlight of my career. I learned more from General McMaster than I have learned working for anybody else in my 30-year career. I learned about leadership, building sound strategies to protect U.S. national security. I learned about maintaining your core character values and integrity in the face of adversity. And I think most importantly, I learned about perseverance and maintaining good humor, even in the toughest situations. I have so many stories that I could recount to demonstrate these lessons, but one sticks out in particular. And this was in the summer of 2018, when we were developing the South Asia strategy that, of course, would be announced later in August 2018, approved first by the president and then announced in a major speech. Well, at this time, as you can imagine, there were many who disagreed with the strategy that was being developed, and they were leaking to the media. There was a lot of criticisms of General McMaster. This made me very angry. I wanted to go on a counterattack against these individuals. But General McMaster was very calm, and so yeah, I went back to my office, late at night, 9 or 10 at night, and was working. We continued to just put our efforts in getting the best strategy possible. But it was about 9 o'clock at night, and an assistant for General McMaster came down to my office and provided me a book. And the book was called Presidential Command by Peter Rodman. And it's all about how the NSC is functioned, why it was stood up, how it is supposed to function. And General McMaster pointed me to a chapter on media leaks. And it was all about how when people are not getting their way, or the policy process is going in a direction they don't like, that's their tool to try to leak about it, to try to change that policy from the outside. So to me, this just showed what leadership is. It's a very difficult time, and General McMaster was thinking about developing his staff. So anyway, I just wanted to share that just to tell you a little bit about General McMaster and his leadership. So let me talk about the evolution of our Afghanistan policy during the Trump administration. And I'll explain how it came to be characterized by that fatal flaw of the title of this talk, Strategic Narcissism. So the first year that I was on the National Security Council staff and working for General McMaster, the first 6 months was focused on developing a strategy for Afghanistan. As General McMaster spelled out, we had failed. We were fighting one year at a time, and not really learning from our mistakes. So we spent a lot of time, dozens of policy meetings at all levels. You have the PCC level, which was what I led, the Policy Coordination Committee, team decisions up for the deputies level meetings, Deputy National Security Advisor, and then those meetings teeing up decisions for the meetings that General McMaster would lead, the principal level meetings, and then, of course, ultimately teeing up decisions or options for the president to make. So we went through that process very methodically. It took some time, as it should. There was a lot of questions. All government agencies had to have their say. We kept refining the approach to address the issues that were raised in the meetings. And we ultimately came up with a set of options for the president. He made his decision, and the result was a very effective South Asia strategy that had all the elements of a strategy to move forward in Afghanistan, and to also recognize that we needed a regional approach to the issue. And I would just highlight some of the high points of the strategy, or main points of the strategy. Things like giving more authority to U.S. fighters on the ground to be able to take the fight to the enemy. There had been a lot of restrictions that were curtailing our troops' ability to engage effectively against the Taliban. So that was something that changed. Bringing training down to the brigade level, making sure that that training was happening at a more at a lower level. That was important. And as General McMaster pointed out, it's not always just about the number of troops you have. It's how they're fighting, how they're organized, what the strategy is. So that was the first major plank of the approach. I mentioned it was a regional approach, and that was very important. Recognizing countries like India, the Central Asian countries, all have a stake in the direction that the country goes in. And then another major plank was, of course, being tougher on Pakistan, recognizing that the Taliban wouldn't be able to continue their fight in Afghanistan were it not for their safe haven in Pakistan. And so this was very clear. The president was very clear. He ended up cutting security assistance to Pakistan until Pakistan took effective action against terrorists and militants that were, killing U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And the other major part of the strategy was that ultimately we were setting the conditions for a peace process, that political process and accommodation that General McMaster mentioned. So that was the goal of the strategy. And as we started moving in to that phase, we had the Kabul Peace Conference in February 2018, where President Ghani, gave an olive branch to the Taliban, inviting them for talks. That was followed a couple months later by an Eid ceasefire that was short-lived, but really quite effective. And this is when General Nicholson was our commanding general in Afghanistan. He had a lot to do with getting that ceasefire implemented. But I have to say, in the fall of 2018, I think we started to see the strategy slip. And I would say that is because the strategy started to fall victim to this idea of strategic narcissism. The interagency and NSC were unable to do their job. We were unable to do an interagency process, and that was stifled. And I think that was a mistake. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton talks in his book about a situation where Secretary Pompeo complained that I and senior DoD officials were trying to interfere in Ambassador Khalilzad's negotiation strategy. Well, Ambassador Bolton sort of half jokingly says, the last time I checked, that's what's called a policy process. So I think it's very important to have that interagency, strategy that's looking at facts on the ground. Because I think otherwise, if you've got a single person, even a single agency, trying to hold on to that process, keep it close hold, not sharing information. I think what happens is you no longer are objectively focusing on those facts on the ground. You're manipulating the facts to fit your own narrative that you want to create, hence strategic narcissism. And I think it became about seeing the Taliban from your own style of thinking. I heard from many of my colleagues, they would say, oh gosh, the Taliban really regrets harboring al-Qaeda. They have learned their lesson. And my response was always, okay, show me the data. Show me the data for that assertion. But there never was any. I think it was wishful thinking, or strategic narcissism, if you will. People brought the wrong assumptions to the table. So it's not surprising that we're now seeing the negotiating process is starting to fall apart. We're not in a very good place. The Biden administration has started another evaluation to see how we might move forward. But I would just point out that there are really very few signs that the Taliban is working toward peace in Afghanistan. In the last few months, they have killed human rights workers, democracy activists, journalists, judges. They are attacking security checkpoints and military bases around provincial capitals. And they're still accommodating Al Qaeda training in Taliban held areas. Um, and I agree with General McMaster, a full troop withdrawal by that May deadline that set out in the Doha Agreement, it would be a disaster. It would put the elected government at risk. It would probably lead to civil war, and it would certainly enable the reemergence of an international terrorist hotbed. So I think those are some of the things that I would want to convey about the importance of maintaining a NSC policy process that is bringing in and mediating all the different opinions and ideas coming from a broad swath of experts throughout the U.S. government, and boiling that down, giving options to the president, and then implementing the plan, following through on the plan. And as I mentioned, I think that started to fall apart in the second half of the Trump administration with regard to Afghanistan. Um, so I will end my remarks there. I'm really looking forward to your questions, and thank you so much.
Hey, Lisa, that was great. Thank you so much for, for such clear analysis in such a short period of time on America's longest war, right? So you got 2 decades in there in 10 minutes, we already have some great questions coming in. The first of these, I think, can pick right up on your remarks. It's from Alan, and he said, how can you address the human, political nature of war when we draw these hard lines between defense and diplomacy and development? Would you comment on that? Maybe about the, Lisa, you've often heard me say this I think, to our team, right? One of the true tests of our strategic competence is the degree to which we are effective at integrating all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners oriented on clearly defined goals and objectives. But what was your experience in this, trying to get that degree of integration? That was your job, right? Because we coordinate and integrated across departments and agencies to provide options to the president, and then to assist with the sensible implementation of his decisions and policies.
Yeah, I agree that is so important to integrate those policies. I think we did that with the development of the South Asia strategy. But again, I think when that process falls down is when the other agencies are maybe not willing to share information for parochial reasons. Then it starts to break down and it's not as effective. And certainly the case in Afghanistan, where the strategy was shifting. There was a lot of pressure toward the end of the Trump administration to draw down troops, to draw down our presence. And that has to be managed very carefully, because obviously as you're drawing down those troop numbers, our U.S. personnel are in more danger. And I'm not only talking about the troops, the soldiers themselves, but also the embassy staff, the U.S. aid staff. So it impacts the ability to be effective in carrying out diplomacy, carrying out our aid programs. So there's very much a relationship there, and there needs to be constant planning and assessing of what the footprint is going to be, not only troops footprint, but also embassy and diplomatic and aid staff. So I think that's extremely important. And I think that's a good question, how important it is to integrate these three things. The economics part of it, Afghanistan's not going to survive if it doesn't have an economy, if it's not able to trade with its neighbors, doesn't develop that infrastructure, root out corruption. So all of these things become very important. when you're looking at an effective strategy for the country. And frankly, I think that, that was always made very clear by General McMaster in the development of the strategy and how we methodically moved forward with that. And, I hope in the Biden administration, we see that same kind of coordination. And my understanding right now is they are reassessing, looking at the strategy. And so it's a good reminder to constantly be integrating, all the elements of U.S. power that we have, and making sure that we're doing that in an integrated, not an ad hoc way where the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. And as General McMaster said, that is the job of the National Security Council. That is what it's there to do, is to coordinate and make sure the implementation is being orchestrated. It's, the NSC is like the conductor of an orchestra. That's really the NSC's role.
And Lisa, reminds me the reason why the NSC was formed, the National Security Council staff was formed, was the result of Pearl Harbor and the disconnects that occurred. But I was so frustrated when I was served in Afghanistan at the lack of integration, and especially, right? I mean, I think just an example, to give Alan an example and the listeners an example, is what we were doing militarily in Afghanistan was completely disconnected from what we were trying to achieve diplomatically. So everybody wanted to talk with the Taliban and form the Taliban political council in Doha, which I was in favor of just getting rid of at the time. But at the same time, as we said, hey, we want to negotiate an agreement with you, we said, oh, we're leaving, by the way. And we put in rules of engagement that didn't even allow our military to actively go after the Taliban in the field. So if you are, letting the enemy operate really with impunity, from at least our perspective, and of course, Afghan security forces were bearing the brunt of these decisions, how does that help convince your enemy to cut a deal with you? And so, Lisa mentioned this book, Presidential Command. I pulled it off my shelf when you mentioned it, and I just want to read a passage from page 76. To get to Alan's question about the State Department, because you hear this today, right? What do you hear today out of the new administration? More diplomacy, more diplomacy, more diplomacy. Okay, hey, for what purpose, right? And how is that diplomatic effort, any diplomatic effort, going to be integrated with all elements of national power, right? Informational, military, law enforcement, economic, and so forth, right? And efforts of like-minded partners. So this is what Peter Robin wrote about. He was writing about the Nixon administration at the time. The department as a whole has an institutional bias in favor of negotiation, dialogue, and diplomatic engagement. That's what they do for a living. It's like the Geico commercial. When you're a diplomat, you do diplomacy. It's what you do, right? So if a problem cannot be solved by these means, then the lead responsibility in the U.S. government is liable to migrate to some other agency, the Pentagon, CIA, that disposes of cruder instruments of policy. Thus, not only policy substance, but bureaucratic turf is at stake. And this is what Lisa was alluding to, right? State, therefore, can rarely ever bring itself to admit that diplomacy is not working. In its mind, diplomacy is perpetually deserving of one more chance. Sometimes this seems to degenerate into dialogue for its own sake, without regards to results or strategy, or, and this is important in Afghanistan context, or even the leverage that might make dialogue more fruitful. So George Shultz, who just passed away last week at the age of 100, who I had the great privilege of being a colleague with here at the Hoover Institution, he once said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the negotiating table. Right? So I think Alan's question is so important, right? That's really the test of strategic competence. And then, hey, Lisa, this next question is an important one, and this is from Nicholas. Nicholas asks, okay, so what's the exit strategy? What does the strategy look like? Would you like to address Nicholas's question, and then I have a few thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you. So number one, I don't think we should call it an exit strategy, right? What are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure that we don't have another 9/11 style attack originating out of Afghanistan. We're trying to make sure that Afghanistan does not become a hub of terrorism again. So let's work backwards. Okay, does that require us to make sure that, you know, the Taliban don't come back to power because, you know, they still have this relationship with Al Qaeda? Yeah, I think it does. Okay, the Taliban, yeah, they have power there. So if we have any hope of leaving at some point, then we do have to try to find a way to moderate their behavior, to you know, allow a situation where the Afghans that we have been supporting for the last 20 years, that want democracy, that want freedom of speech, that want girls to go to school, that want to be part of the modern international community, that they are not, you know, beaten back by the Taliban, and we're not at square one. So, you know, pursuing a peace process, you know, is the right step, but it's how you do it. You know, how are you using your leverage? Are you really using your leverage effectively? Like General McMaster said, are you casting that shadow of power across the negotiating table? Because, you know, that is how you're going to have an effective peace process, a peace process that results in something that still protects US national security. It shouldn't be this sort of fake deal, you know, that I think is also a problem, this elusive deal. The focus becomes on just completing that deal, you know, paying no attention to what's happening on the ground, or, you know, what are the elements of that deal, and, you know,
And
it
make
really,
concession after concession to get it, right?
right,
Force the Afghan government to release 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth. Then say, oh, well, you know, we can still have a deal even if there is no ceasefire. So continue killing Afghans like they did an attack in a maternity hospital, Lisa. I mean, they gunned down expectant mothers and infants, right? So these are the people we're dealing with. I'm sorry, go ahead. I just want
yeah,
to
no,
amplify that.
I think that's right. And I think the way forward is to focus our leverage on gaining a comprehensive ceasefire and that political roadmap. This is in the agreement. You know, and that, I think if we focus on that rather than just, oh, we need to force the Afghan government to release another set of thousands and thousands of prisoners. You know, we should be looking at how do we get the two sides to a comprehensive ceasefire, a political roadmap, use our leverage that way. And I think that would demonstrate that we are seeking a genuine peace process that reduces violence, that stops the targeted killings, rather than we're just pursuing an exit, and we're cloaking our exit in this facade of a peace deal. So I think that's the way forward, is using our leverage better, working more with our NATO and European partners. Our NATO and European partners have not been happy that they also have not been consulted closely on the negotiating process and the Doha agreement. And it's in the Doha agreement, it says that US and NATO forces will be leaving by such and such a date, yet there was no consultation. So I think that the Biden administration has its work cut out for it to rebuild that transatlantic alliance on Afghanistan, because the NATO and European countries are also concerned about a destabilized region. They're concerned about empowering terrorist groups, and they're concerned about the potential for a massive refugee crisis if the Taliban is to militarily run over the country again. So I think moving forward, the United States needs to work more closely with Europe and NATO on the peace process itself. And Pakistan's role also remains critical. They want a good relationship with the Biden administration. The Biden administration should use that as leverage. They should, you know, convince Islamabad that it has to press the Taliban to reduce violence, to accept an international troop extension. There's just no way around it. We cannot fully withdraw US troops by May 1st and hope to have any semblance of stability in Afghanistan. So, you know, let's, you know, rely on Pakistan, not rely, but make clear that what they do and how they use their influence with the Taliban will impact the US bilateral relationship with Pakistan and international countries, the Europeans as well. It'll impact their relationship with these countries moving forward.
Hey, I'm just going to introduce a question from Bobby as well, and then comment on your answer to Nicholas's question. Bobby said, "Hey, how come we don't learn from previous experience, right? In Vietnam, we didn't learn from the first Indochina War, and it doesn't seem like we learned from the Soviet experience in Afghanistan." And so, but Bobby, what I would say is that I think there is a common misframing, misunderstanding of the nature of our fight in Afghanistan, and this is kind of the so-called graveyard of empires interpretation of the war. What's different about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan is that I would not say that we are an occupying power, right? We have now 2,500 troops on the ground. We have like 4,500. What we were doing is we were enabling, strengthening an elected government, okay, an ugly election, okay, but an election nonetheless, and Afghan security forces, Afghans who were bearing the brunt of the fight so that they would not have to return to the hell that was Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001, and that they continue to enjoy the freedoms that they have enjoyed since 2001. And we don't talk about this, but Afghanistan has probably the most free press in the entire region, right across the Middle East. No women could go to school at all under Taliban rule. Women are in school. I think there were like 3 phones in Kabul, a city the size of 500,000 in 2001. Now everybody is connected to the world through cell phones. And what is Kabul? I think it's like 6 million people now, isn't it, Lisa, or almost 6 million people. So there has been tremendous progress, but it's been ugly thanks to the Taliban, right? Because the standards are pretty low for terrorist organizations. Right? Building something is always much harder than trying to tear something down, which is what they're trying to do, is tear it down, incite fear. Lisa mentioned these assassination campaign that's going on now, for example. Who are they killing? They're killing young people, young activists who want representative government, who want freedom of the press, who want to live under rule of law, who want equal treatment under the law for men and women. That's who they're killing. And so I think that is a worthy objective to sustain our effort there and prioritize sustained support for Afghanistan over a withdrawal. What if the narrative on Afghanistan was completely wrong? Hey, what if we won already and we just never acknowledged it? And we just said, okay, hey, Afghanistan's not going to be Denmark, but it doesn't need to be Denmark. And we can support Afghans at a sustainable level of commitment. Lisa, I mean, I think it's true now that the European contributions to the coalition in Afghanistan are now larger than the US force on the ground, for example. And I know you worked very hard to drive costs down, like from, I think, $122 billion a year initially, down to well below $20 billion a year, which I tend to think of for Nicholas is that's an insurance policy, right? That is winning. And in terms of what does this exit strategy look like, or what should be the components of a consolidation of gains in Afghanistan look like? I think it's 4 key tasks. One is to help forge a political accommodation between the various groups inside of Afghanistan, right? So that they know they can advance their interests through a political process. The second is what Lisa already alluded to, which is to get countries in the region to play a more constructive or a least destructive role in the case of Pakistan. And I think we have the leverage, we being the United States and other partners who could join us, for example, like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, others who could put pressure on Pakistan to change its behavior. And then third, the Afghan state has to be hardened against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban. That's the support for security forces and the support for the government over time. That's the economic dimension, to get Afghanistan at some point in the future to no longer be a ward of the international community. And then the fourth part of the effort is what Lisa just talked about, which is a sustained international effort where we can burden share, and we can do this, right? So Afghanistan is not the graveyard. In fact, Lisa, you may want to talk, I know you know more about this, but the historical record is it's super hard for an insurgency to dislodge an Afghan government if that government is receiving predictable and sustained foreign support, as the Afghan government did until the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think Nicholas and Bobby's questions are linked in that connection, Any comments on Bobby's in terms of, not learning from the Soviet experience and so forth?
Yeah, I think that you're right that if we look at the Soviet experience, they withdrew the troops first, but they kept some of the funding going for the Najibullah regime. But it was about 2 years later, after the troops had left. The troops left in '89, but it was what, 91, 92, when the financial support was pulled from the Najibullah regime, and of course, fell quickly thereafter. So that is important to keep in mind. Again, it's the tools. What kind of tools are we willing to apply? Are we willing to continue to fund the Afghan security forces? Are we willing to continue the economic assistance that helps the government to move forward? And I think, General McMaster, your point about, maybe in some ways we've won. Why aren't we acknowledging how far the country has come? The fact that they've had, 5 elections, both, presidential and parliamentary elections. The fact that, so many more young women are going to school, holding government positions. Why aren't we talking about some of the successes? Why is it always characterized as, a loser issue? We shouldn't have any troops there at all, et cetera. We do need troops there, as I spelled out. I think it'd be a disaster if we left May 1st. We won't need troops forever. But the important thing is remembering who have we invested in over the last 20 years, who has partnered with us on counterterrorism operations, most recently last fall when we took out al-Qaeda leader Abu Musin al-Masri last October. Well, it's the Afghan National Security Forces. So I think, it would be wrong both from a moral and a strategic perspective to withdraw our support completely from the Afghan security forces. They deserve our support. We've fought side by side for 20 years now. We've taken out a lot of terrorists with their cooperation. So I think, we should stop thinking in terms of if we haven't accomplished every single thing, if we don't have Valhalla, the central government, if there's, we still have some challenges, that means we've lost. No, we've achieved a great deal in Afghanistan. It's not, an optimal time for us to withdraw our forces. No, but let's not forget what we have accomplished. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a peace process. I think we should. I think the challenge for the Biden administration right now is to figure out how we can extend our troop presence, which we need to do, but yet keep the Taliban in the negotiating process, because it is important, but we need to focus that process on a comprehensive ceasefire, a political roadmap that involves all the players.
Yeah, Lisa, I have 3 questions I'm going to try to link here. And one is from Tyler, who said, "What can we do to prevent more troops?" We're talking a little bit about this now, but then Thor says, "Okay, what's the best situation we can hope for then? What does Afghanistan look like for the foreseeable future?" And then Adam said, asked like, do we always need to win? Like, what is this part of our strategic narcissism, is to think that we have to prevail in these conflicts? Well, first of all, I'll just say that it's really not about preventing more troops, but it's really what those troops do. I mean, I can't believe, Lisa, how we got into this discussion now where we're counting like numbers of troops all the time, rather than trying to understand better what are the capabilities that we need to strengthen Afghan forces so that they can continue to take the brunt of the fight, for example, against the Taliban and other jihadist terrorist organizations. And for Thor, I would just say, hey, what's the best situation? Hey, Afghanistan's going to be a violent place, right? There's going to be violence in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. But I think that violence can mainly be in rural areas with key population centers and key territories secured by increasingly capable Afghan security forces. I think that Afghanistan will be a ward of the international community for the foreseeable future, but could get on a path to economic independence, especially through more effective regional economic integration. And if Afghanistan can take advantage of the rich mineral wealth there, especially I think in rare earth metals like lithium, for example. And of course, if there's security, it's easier to export that kind of thing, and to build infrastructure that can make it viable and competitive in the long term. Then I think that from the Afghan state, what does it look like? I mean, I think that corruption can be reduced to the degree that it is no longer a fatal threat to the state. And these institutions can get on the path of incremental reform. My friend Nader Nadiri, Lisa, who you know, has been working on this for a long time. He's very realistic about this, but I think that there's been some significant progress in civil service reform that's been championed by Ashraf Ghani as a president, but many others in his administration as well. But part of that is political will to do it, and part of that is a sustained commitment over time. And then I think, what does it look like? It looks like Pakistan and others in the region conclude, hey, we can advance our interests in Afghanistan through diplomacy, right? Instead of being part of the problem in connection with the violence. And then with the Taliban, I think, and this gets to Thor's question, I think we can convince the Taliban over time that they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. I mean, heck, Thor, like, what is power sharing with the Taliban look like? Is that mass executions in the soccer stadium like every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? Right? That's going to be a horrible humanitarian crisis. And in terms of winning, I would say that winning in war is not only important from a perspective of our interests, but it's important from an ethical perspective. And I don't think you can't go wrong by applying St. Thomas Aquinas's jus ad bellum theory. And one aspect of that is that before you engage in a war, you have to have a just end in mind. And if you're not fighting to achieve that just end, not only is your strategy counterproductive, but that war may become unethical to begin with. Because remember, we're asking people to take risks and make sacrifices, right? And you want to be able to tell those young servicemen and women that they're making those sacrifices and taking those risks to achieve a worthy outcome. If you don't win, would you get it? I don't think you get in a boxing ring and say, well, I may not try to win here. I mean, you're gonna get beat up, right? So I think that there's just a fundamental necessity to win. And win is not, driving into Berlin and VE Day in Europe, but winning is getting to that sustainable outcome that I described with those various components to it. Lisa, any comments on those questions?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything completely, and would just make the point. Look, we do want our ideology to prevail. We don't want international terrorists to succeed. And, most of the other countries in the world agree with us on that. And that's why we have this huge coalition that has been with us for the last 20 years in Afghanistan. It's not just the US.
And Lisa, I think the number's right. Over 90% of Afghans think the Taliban should have zero role in government.
That's right. That's right. So I just wanted to make that point that we're not trying to conquer Afghanistan. That is not the way to think about it. We want an Afghanistan that is connected with the modern world, that is not isolated because of their policies. This is the strategy. It's not about the U.S. conquering a country. It's about the U.S. supporting those in the country that want a better future, that don't want international terrorism to prevail in their country. And this is what we're looking at. And in terms of the regional economic integration, I think the previous administration did do quite a bit on this in terms of engaging with the Central Asian states, getting them involved. Uzbekistan comes to mind as a country that really has invested in both working with the Afghan government on economic projects, but also the peace process itself, and has been an integral part of that regional support for the peace process. When you look at this peace process, you're looking at diplomacy on several different levels happening all at the same time, right? You have to engage the people of Afghanistan. You have to get their input. What do they want? What are they looking for? You have to look at getting the warring side sitting down, which is happening in the intra-Afghan talks. You have to have the regional players invested in the process, the surrounding countries. And then you have to have, the US, Europe, NATO element, the kind of, supporting that internal process. So there are so many different levels of the peace process, the integration um, of the country into the international community that needs to happen. And so it goes beyond that, we're trying to conquer a country. No, that's absolutely not what we are trying to do. It never has been. And so I think, it's important to get our terminology correct, to get our goals correct before we start saying, well, we lost that war, let's get out. It's a lost cause, let's get out. I think that's far too simplistic.
Lisa, I can't believe we only have 3 minutes left. Okay.
Oh,
So Charbel had a question that I'm going to answer really quickly. He said, Hezbollah has been integrated into government of Lebanon for 15 years. This has been a detriment to Lebanese economy. What may, and security. What makes you think integrating extremist non-state actors into government can help build statehood in those countries? Hey, I don't think it can, Charbel. And I think what's important is you have to splinter these groups so you can differentiate between who are reconcilable and which elements are irreconcilable, and not try to force the irreconcilable elements into some sort of a governance system that they're going to subvert and try to turn against its very purpose, which is to give people a say in how they're governed. And Lisa, there's the last question I thought we might both take on. I'll give you the first shot. Is from Jennifer, and we always have like 3 minutes now, 2.5 minutes. She said, okay, hey, what can we learn from Afghanistan that might be applied to our current domestic situation and extremist groups here in the United States, or maybe just more broadly, beyond the United States?
that's a fascinating question. I think, there is something to be said for, what drives people to extremism, and how does that apply to what we have seen, the events on horrific events on January 6th against our own democracy and coming from within our own country. And I think that we're starting to learn about some of the propaganda and the lies that have been fed to people in our own country, that have fed this extremists, for lack of a better word, resort to violence rather than looking toward our institutions and our political process. It's a very slippery slope, and I think we do have to look inward and think about how we ensure that our freedoms, and our free press is not in fact working against us, and that we make sure that our institutions stay strong, stay resilient. And so I think that's very much a lesson that we need to take away from the horrible events of January 6th. And just one last point on the previous question on how do you integrate extremist actors into the state. I think that the Taliban and what it represents will not be just wiped out completely. I think that we do have to find a way to find elements that are more peaceful or more moderate. Frankly, I would say that it was a positive thing that Ambassador Khalilzad pressed the Pakistanis to release Mullah Baradar, who had shown more propensity toward a peace process, toward peace talks. I'm not saying he's, Nelson Mandela.
Enlightened.
He's not Nelson Mandela, right? But we do have to look for those people we can deal with. We just have to do it in a very data-driven way. We can't allow our wishful thinking or our timelines or our how we think about things. We can't allow our strategic logic to make us think, our enemies think the same way. But at the same time, we do need to look for those players that can perhaps move the needle in terms of a political peace process. I'll just leave it at that.
Hey, Lisa, I can't thank you enough. I would just add at the end to Jennifer's question, I think it's a cycle of ignorance, hatred, and violence. Ignorance is used to foment hatred, and hatred is used to justify violence. You have to break that cycle. It's a much different situation here, obviously, than it is in places like Afghanistan, but I think that general construct sometimes works. Hey, Lisa, it was great. It was great to see you. Thanks for your amazing service to our country. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Hey, remember, we have March 9th coming up with our old colleague, Joel Rayburn. Lisa, we're going to focus more on Iraq there. And I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the Sign Institute for the privilege of being with you. And especially, I want to thank Tyler Eliadis and Paulina Mendoza for promoting this and helping to put this on as well. But Lisa, it's great to see you. I know you're going to do amazing work and scholarship at CNAS, and that's going to help this new administration as well grapple with these problems. And so thank you so much for joining us. And again, thanks to our audience especially. Take care, everybody. Stay well.
Thank you.